Okay, thanks, Kristen. Good morning, everyone, or good evening. So Adriana and I, with help from Kim, have been working on this presentation over the last couple weeks, and I think it's been very insightful and educational and useful for me. So hopefully it will instill some good ideas in all of you and generate some good dialogue at the end of the presentation. So we are talking about networks of water isotope observations this morning. And so I just wanted to go back to our working group objectives at the very beginning. And remember, we have 6 objectives, and they're all somewhat interrelated, of course. But I really honed in on objective number 4 in the context of this particular presentation. And that's that we want to identify a set of high-priority scientific targets for the next generation of water isotope observational systems. So system being the key word here, because we're thinking about this concept of networks today. So why networks? So in the context of, in particular, these 21st century science targets that we're going to identify in this working group. So why networks? Fundamentally, we're focusing on this concept of networks because we have to observe spatio-temporal variability in order to understand its dynamical origins in the context of the climate system. And so, simply, we need observations distributed across space. We need observations in more than one place to do this. And so these sub-bullets here just focus on some of the interesting questions we're targeting with this type of network development. So understanding regional water budgets in the context of water isotopes. This can be important because we want to get at both precipitation and evaporation, of course, but also water vapor transport, moisture sources, things like that. And isotopes are extremely useful for getting us that information. We also want to, on a basic level, understand precipitation regimes. Thinking about ways of classifying precipitation types categorically, and we can do that effectively with water isotope values. And then finally, there are many smaller scale processes, of course, that we're interested in understanding, and looking at these processes across the different regions can give us an understanding of larger scale patterns of these processes, such as mixing, or for example, rain evaporation, or the ratio of stratiform to convective precipitation. And so we'll be touching on all those in more detail in this talk today. So another reason for why networks are so valuable. One thing that we want to do is target modes of the climate system that have what we're calling distinct spatial fingerprints in isotope space. And in particular, we're focused here on climate modes like ENSO or perhaps the PDO that are either poorly understood, or if they are understood, they're poorly modeled. And so again, we need a network, a distribution of observations to really capture those climate modes, which are these large-scale patterns. And then finally on this slide, one thing we're very interested in with isotopes is using them to evaluate global changes in the water cycle. And so the nature of this inquiry is large scale. We're thinking about changes across zonal bands across the entire Earth. And so obviously we need multiple observations to do that. And so some of the questions or interests within the context of understanding changes in the water cycle are listed here, including atmospheric residence time, moisture length scales, moisture recycling efficiencies. And then I also put this in at the end, so we're talking about the ocean as well as the atmosphere, of course. Seawater isotope patterns are able to archive aspects of the atmospheric moisture budget as well, and changes in the global water cycle along with salinity. Okay, and so just one more slide of network value here. Another reason networks could be valuable is that looking at across individual sites where we have observations, we will be able to quantify the scale of the spatial continuity for interpretive purposes. So another way of saying that is if we have a time series of delta 18 of precipitation at one site, what can that one record at that one site tell us about large-scale changes in regional hydrology? And so this is important in the context of proxy records that are based on stable isotopes. Again, we may not have isotope records from various proxies everywhere around the world, but we may have some in key locations, and they might be, say, the only record that we have to understand regional changes in hydrology in the past. And then these last two bullets, networks are also valuable, of course, for improving observational statistics of key processes, in particular key processes that we're trying to parameterize or model more effectively. And that can include things like convective organization, various processes within clouds or rain events, as well as mixing in the ocean and the atmosphere. And that goes back to improving these numerical predictions, especially evaluating these parameterizations and providing correct boundary conditions and evaluating climate sensitivity in models. So what we're going to do next is go through some examples of all of these bullet points. And Adriana and I will be taking turns. So Adriana will tackle the next slide.
Great. So I'll start to unpack this idea of looking at spatio-temporal variability and trying to understand its drivers. And one thing to keep in mind as we start to go through these slides is realize that when we're using the word network of observations, we're using that word somewhat loosely. And you'll see that because some of these first examples I'm going to show you are actually using satellite-based observations. So spatio-temporal variability, I think there are some really zeroth order fundamental reasons why we try to observe it. It's really intrinsic to our weather and climate system. If we understand variability, we have better confidence knowing what uncertainties there are around predicting new climate states. And as Jess pointed out, it's also something that the variability itself can give us clues as to what are the processes that are at play. So here, you'll notice in the footer of some of these slides, there are examples of some of the types of work that have really tackled this general science area. These aren't exhaustive lists by any means, but they're really more suggestive, if you will. And so here in this case, I've listed some studies that have tried to look at climatological wet and dry regions and the processes that control them. And then also some of these later studies by Brown and Lee, these are works that have tried to more map globally where smaller scale processes like mixing and cloud types, where they dominate. So the example I really wanted to focus on today is an example of how we might think of building a network to observe spatio-temporal variability in order to understand dynamical drivers is this recent work by Jonathan Wright in PNAS. And essentially what Wright and colleagues were looking at was the transition from dry season to wet season over the Amazon. And so the figure on the left is showing you in the left-hand column patterns of specific humidity, the top showing you the end of the dry season and the bottom showing you the wet season. And on the right, he has spatial maps of isotope ratios in water vapor from the satellite-based tropospheric emission spectrometer, which we call TESS. And really here what he's done is he's used then the spatio-temporal patterns of the isotopes to say something about the drivers of this transition from dry to wet. And in this case, what we're looking at is if you sort of hone in, you'll kind of just barely see the continent, and this may be hard in your slide, but essentially that green blob in the top right panel is isotopic enrichment over most of the continent of South America. And so it's the fact that you see this real enrichment over the continent that indicates that evapotranspiration is a strong driver of preconditioning and pre-moistening of the atmosphere that then allows deep convection to develop and move into the wet season. So I thought this was a nice example of how you could imagine them trying to establish some sort of a network of, say, ground-based observations or continued satellite surveying to try to map out these processes and really understand the drivers of a humidity or moisture shift.
Great. So moving on to the next example of how isotopes can help us understand the signature of climate modes that have these distinct spatial fingerprints. This is an example of patterns of delta 18 values in precipitation during El Nino events across the tropical Pacific. And this is from an older paper, and it was done with, this type of work was shown here is just for one model versus observations, but this was also done for many models in the Swing 2 experiment. But the take-home point here is that I think, number one, we can get more information from delta 18 values of precipitation than we can from precipitation alone. So if you look at the patterns here of precipitation on the right versus delta 18 on the left, you see this displacement of the El Nino-related anomaly, and that's due to the advection of depleted moisture via the somewhat weaker but still persistent trade winds in this region. And another important point from this particular figure is that I think it really highlights the absence of real observations, isotope observations across the tropical Pacific, as you can see in that upper left-hand panel there, the GNIP data. We just don't have the observations right now to really assess if this is what we see in the real world. And so this is just one example with ENSO, but down at the bottom here you can see a couple other papers that do this with different patterns and different modes. For example, these Liu et al. Papers looking at the P&A pattern across North America in delta 18 values of precipitation. And you can also do this in the ocean too with seawater delta 18 values, which Sam did with some model results in her recent paper, looking at modes, decomposing that big gridded data set of delta 18 seawater values from the model and seeing that the first mode is this long-term trend and the second mode is Central Pacific style ENSO. And so in terms of climate modes, we can think about the ocean, we can think about delta 18 and precipitation, of course, but we can also think about signatures in the atmosphere in vapor isotopes. And so this is a great example from a recent paper by Sylvia D. and colleagues, where she's showing that stable isotope values of vapor in the upper troposphere are tracking the strength of the Walker circulation between these cold and warm phases of ENSO. And so what we can see here is that during an El Nino, there's reduced convection in the West Pacific warm pool, and this leads to less enriched boundary layer vapor, making it to these upper elevations in the atmosphere, and ultimately giving us this sort of what you see depletion in that region. And then moving over longitudinally towards the Eastern Pacific, we see a reduction in subsidence during an El Nino event and perhaps an increase in enriched boundary layer vapor, making it to the upper elevations of the atmosphere due to increased convection. So these spatial fingerprints can be observed in isotopes of vapor, of precipitation, and seawater.
And knowing that isotopes in water vapor or in precipitation or seawater are valuable in identifying really large-scale humidity patterns, I think a very natural follow-on is then asking, how can we use these tools to try to understand global water cycle changes with anthropogenic warming? And again, at the bottom, there are a few examples of papers that have sort of been thinking along these lines, if not asking that very specific question, using water isotopic information. But the example that I wanted to tell you in a little more detail is actually not a water isotope study. It was a water tagging experiment done by Hansi Singh with help from also Jesse and David. And what Hansi's work is looking at is trying to understand predicted changes in precipitation with a doubling of CO2. So this figure on the left is showing you changes in precipitation zonally, and that's the blue trace. And what you see is there's generally an increase across most latitude bands. Now the other traces are showing you where that change in precipitation, where that change in moisture is coming from. And the green line right around zero is actually the local change in evaporation. So it's not an increase in local evaporation that's driving precipitation changes in most regions of the globe, according to these water tagging experiments in general circulation models. Instead, what it is the more orange-brown trace. It's changes in this remote contribution, moisture that's being evaporated elsewhere and transported in. So how is that relevant for isotopes, or how can we start to think then about designing an isotopic observational strategy to address a question like this one? Recent work that I just finished is shown on the right, and it suggests that the isotope ratio in water vapor or precipitation is fairly well represented by a linear combination of these two factors, which I've spelled out here. One is a local drying factor, so that's sort of how efficiently moisture is removed from the atmosphere by precipitation locally. And the other is this term L, which is a mean distance that remote moisture travels into the region. So what Hansi's work suggests is that as precipitation changes with the doubling of CO2, it's going to change this term L. And we should be able to see that term L then in isotopic measurements. So maybe that's the kinds of opportunities that we could start to look for in really spelling out the scientific targets that we would want to advocate for as a working group.
Okay, moving on now to another motivation for water isotope and water isotope observational network. One thing that we want to do is understand the spatial footprint of measurements. So we can't have water isotope observations everywhere in the world, and we certainly can't have paleoclimate isotope-based observations everywhere in the world. So one key question is, if we have a time series at a single site, and we want to say something about larger scale variability across a broader region, where are the ideal sites to do something like that? And so this is just a great example from Jess Morman's paper a few years ago in EPSL, where she shows the power of isotopes in reflecting regional hydrology as contrasted with the reduced ability of precipitation alone at a single site to show us that variability. So Delta 18 in Borneo here in the Western Pacific, where we see this little red dot, Delta 18 there is highly correlated with precipitation across the entire tropical Pacific, whereas down here, precipitation at Borneo is only correlated with precipitation in a very localized region. So the isotopes here are very powerful at telling us about changes in regional hydrology across the tropical Pacific. So we don't really have anything like that for the oceans because the time series that we do have are incredibly short. But this is just a taste of what we could do if we had longer time series. And this is based on 2 short time series of Delta 18 in seawater from Palau and the Galapagos. And it's showing correlation coefficients between those isotope values and salinity, precipitation, and evaporation. And so you can start to see these patterns emerge telling us about what larger scale, the larger scale controls on the Delta 18 of seawater at this singular location. And so this would help with how expansive our interpretations of these isotope records would be. And you can see that there's strong relationships with salinity, of course, but Palau has much stronger relationships with precipitation and evaporation, suggesting Delta 18 of seawater here is more directly influenced by moisture balance, whereas in the Galapagos and the Eastern Pacific, we see weaker relationships with precipitation and evaporation, suggesting that mixing processes or advection are more important in this region.
Yeah, that kind of speaks to the importance of choice of where you site the network of observations too. One of the other scientific themes that we had brought up at the very beginning was that you could use a network of observations to really tackle process level questions. And I think we're all very familiar with the utility of using isotopic measurements to try to tease apart processes in the water cycle. Often, I suppose maybe this is just my own sort of personal feeling, is that we often think about a process level study targeting a very specific area, looking at something very small scale, maybe over a short temporal time period. But I'd like to suggest that we really could use a longer term network that's geographically spread out to also answer these process level questions, because as Jess mentioned at the beginning, it gives us a lot more statistical reliability or power in being able to cover various climatic zones over, say, several years or many years. So there are certainly many types of processes that we're interested from an isotopic perspective. And again, you'll see a lot of examples of how we've used isotopes to answer them in the footer of this slide. The example I'm going to tell you about in a little more detail is work by Shahang Feng and colleagues that's just out in ACPD. And what they've done is they've taken data from 7 cruises, water vapor measurements from seven cruises, and used those to try to develop and evaluate a diffusion mixing model for oceanic evaporation. So a new physical way of thinking about how oceanic evaporation works and sets the isotope ratio of surface water vapor. And what's shown on the right then is a comparison of their new model, which is shown in isotopic phase space. It's probably hard to see, but the left axis is delta D, the right axis is O18. And so the model phase space shows up in gray and the observations in red for various of these three sites. So again, just the example here is that they're taking data, a compilation of data from multiple measurement areas, and then really using that to try to develop a more physically based model for oceanic evaporation.
So similarly in the ocean, delta 18 of seawater has been considered a water mass tracer for a long time. This is something that Allegra has been talking about for a long time. And so we can use these values as a way to assess the mixing of water masses, constrain a budget for delta 18 of seawater, and assess this relationship between delta 18 of seawater and salinity. And this becomes important when we want to characterize how the atmospheric moisture budget is manifested in the mixed layer of the ocean, and going back into isotope-based paleoclimate records from the ocean, what these records tell us about past changes in ocean circulation and the atmospheric moisture budget in terms of P minus E. So this is just a simple example of that from the Benway and Mix paper from a while back that shows in this delta 18 salinity space, we have each of these water masses clearly represented in different areas of the scatter plots. So they have distinct isotopic signatures and a distinct relationship with salinity. So that information can be very useful for thinking about changes in ocean mixing and, again, understanding the ocean delta 18 seawater budget. More recently, at the process level, Sam had a really cool paper in 2015 showing the importance of these very small-scale tropical instability waves of these fronts associated with changes in delta 18 of seawater in the Central Pacific. And so if we had enough observations, this could be something that we could constrain with the network. But this type of work is model-based at the moment, given the limitations we have in terms of seawater isotope observations.
And speaking of models, one of our last scientific themes was trying to improve numerical predictions with more of a network of observations of isotope ratios. And of course, last time Jesse gave us a lot of good examples of the benefit of including water isotopic tracers in numerical models. One of the main reasons in my mind is then when we look at water patterns in our models, we can determine if they're getting the right patterns for the right reasons. But that means that we also have to have the observations against which to compare those models to make sure that they are the right patterns. And certainly, work that's been done in the past for model development, such as work by Jesse and Camille and Allegra and others that are part of this working group, has of course taken advantage of whatever observational information is available to try to evaluate and develop their models. One place I think we could really move as a community is towards putting some of the outstanding climate questions that are sort of big challenges in the model development world. And the example of I'm thinking here is climate sensitivity. One of the things that I was pretty shocked to find out is that NCAR's community atmosphere model, its latest version, the climate sensitivity just keeps going up and up. And so it's now quite alarming how much warming we expect for a given amount of greenhouse gas forcing. One of the tuning knobs in NCAR's model that makes the climate sensitivity really go up or down is how much re-evaporation occurs below the clouds. So this sometimes is what we call rain re-evaporation. And of course, rain re-evaporation itself is very hard to measure, but its isotopic trace might not be, and that's what these examples here suggest. This is an observational study by Pascal Gross and others like Charles Sodeman, and what they're looking at is an isotopic space that's defined by the delta and the deuterium excess differences between surface water vapor and precipitation. And what they find is that in that space, there's this very clear linear relationship that indicates how much rain re-evaporation is occurring. So I'm starting to wonder if we could use an observational strategy like this one to try to pin down climate sensitivity numbers in models like NCAR's community atmosphere model so that we have much more confidence in our predictions of future climate. Okay, Now that we've provided you all with few examples of the kinds of science themes that we might target with an observational network, I think where we'll go next is sort of touching upon some of the existing observational systems that are in place or that are in the works.
All right, starting off with our faithful friend GNIP, the Global Network of Isotopes and Precipitation. So I'll talk about what this network is and then why it's not good enough for our purposes in the 21st century. So this is a network that began in 1961 with precipitation collection happening around the world, and you can see all the dots on this map representing sites where monthly samples, for the most part, have been collected of rainwater. This was done by the International Atomic Energy Agency and the World Meteorological Organization. And so for each of these sites, we have on a monthly time scale delta 18 of precipitation, delta D of precipitation, and sometimes tritium values. And the goal of this network, when it was developed back in the 1960s, was really just basic data collection to just understand from a zeroth order, as Adriana mentioned, spatial, temporal variability and precipitation, isotope values. And the secondary goal, of course, was to importantly monitor nuclear fallout via the tritium isotopes. So this network is still used constantly, and its purposes are often for comparison or validation to simulated precipitation isotope values, and Adriana will touch on that more deeply in the next slide. And also just to gain this understanding that we desire of global scale to regional scale to local scale, even temporal climate variability as archived in these stable isotope values. So if you're lucky, there is a GNIP station in your study area or multiple GNIP stations, but there are some serious limitations, and this network is no longer enough or satisfactory for many people's climate questions. And the issues are that few of these stations, although you see lots and lots of dots on this map, few of these stations are actually contemporaneous. So you don't have simultaneous collection of precipitation at every single site on this map at the same time. So some sites you might have ended in, say, the 1960s. So for example, this dot here representing Christmas Island, I know only contains data from 1962 to 1964. And so very few of these stations that you see in that image also have long time series. So those stations that have more than 10 years of data are very special and very rare. And so our understanding of interannual and decadal and longer variability as archived in these isotopes is completely limited. And then finally, of course, there's plenty of undersampled areas in this map as well, in particular the tropics. And when this network was designed, they wanted to just characterize spatial variability and stable isotope values, but there was no specific design to target the kinds of climate questions that we've been discussing in the previous slide.
And because GNIP sort of is that long-standing, traditionally used network, we did want to mention a few of its many, many applications in the literature. Here are just a couple. On the right-hand side, you'll see an example of taking GNIP data and using it to evaluate a model field, the isotope ratios of precipitation. This is from Jesse's recent paper, but many of the other members of this group have done similar things, and I've tried to list a few studies representing some different models that have compared their simulations against GNIP here below. And then also on the left, an example more of trying to understand spatio-temporal variability and its climatic drivers. This is work from Gabe Bowen looking at the intra-annual or seasonal variations in O18 of precipitation, taking the GNIP data, which are shown by the black dots, and then interpolating them in a map-like sense to fill in the continents with these shaded colors.
So I just wanted to touch very briefly on one additional network called USNIP, US Network of Isotopes and Precipitation. I won't say much about this because these data are not publicly available and they're somewhat difficult to get although if this is something we want to continue in the future, anyone can request samples from an organization called the National Atmospheric Deposition Program and get these water samples from around the country and measure their isotopic ratios. But this network was weekly resolved, so much higher resolution than GNIP. And as far as I know, in the literature, went from 1989 to 1995 and may or may not be ongoing in some places. But this represents another network that people have used in the literature to understand the spatio-temporal variability in isotopes. And for example, what's essential in establishing that there is a manifestation of the PNA pattern in these stable isotope values in those Liu papers that I had on an earlier slide. Okay, moving on to the ocean now. So we do not have a observational network for the global ocean. There are plenty of databases, of course, one key database in particular, but someone else will be talking about that in a future meeting, so more on that later. But the only networks we necessarily have are created by individual PIs and largely not coordinated. And so just as an example, currently my lab's collecting seawater from the Galapagos and Palau in the tropical Pacific. Kim's lab is collecting seawater from the Line Islands. And there are plenty of opportunities to collect seawater isotope data from samples from cruises where you get in on the ground floor and get someone to take those samples for you and mail them to you. But the few long-term collections that we have from the ocean are by necessity typically near shore because someone has to go out on a boat and take your samples or go to the shore and take them. So they're not representing the open ocean by any means. In our case, they were weekly resolved. So in terms of the resolution, we're talking about weekly resolution or longer. And if we do have these collections, the ideal way to do them, thinking about this, would be to have contemporaneous sampling across multiple sites, so we can again be able to understand and observe that spatial variability. So we want observations from both, for example, the Western Pacific and the Eastern Pacific in the same month and in the same weeks, ideally, to characterize the progression of an El Nino event and how that manifests in the isotopic composition of seawater. And so this is just a quick image of one short-term network from a recent paper by Kim and I, where we show sites in the Galapagos and Christmas Island, Manus Island off Papua New Guinea, and Palau. And so for a while there, we did have contemporaneous sampling going at all these sites. Palau and Galapagos are still ongoing, and then Kim's group is working on Christmas Island. So this is something we'd want to, say, expand for future science questions.
I think very much like the ocean networks and very different from the precipitation networks, water vapor in situ measurements have also been largely uncoordinated. They've been individually led by individual PIs. And that said, it's kind of amazing how much of the, at least northern hemisphere, we've been able to cover. And that's shown by this figure from Joe Galuski's review of water isotopes in water vapor. That map, each time you see some colorful dots and squares and triangles in a box, that's indicating one site where something on the order of a year to a couple years of water isotope measurements have been made. And really, a lot of this development has been spurred by the advent of these commercial water isotopic analyzers like the Picaro instrument that is shown in the figure in the bottom left. And really, these only came out in the mid-2000s, and so a lot of our time series are limited to the more recent decades. Lacking a real coordinated kind of in situ network, I think there's been an attempt to try to synthesize what water vapor data there is through various database efforts. And so you could imagine them trying to use these databases with an almost network-like analytical approach. And I don't want to talk too much about databases because I think I'd be stepping on Gabe's toes. I imagine we're having a presentation down the line on that. But I'll give you this one example of a recent database that's on Yale and Harvard's websites, the Stable Water Vapor Isotopes database. To give you a little sense of this, it's got about 35 sites that cover 15 climatic regions, and it's providing hourly average data. So you can start to think based on this map and all of these little bubbles, that you really could start to begin to intercompare sites and think about processes that are acting across geographic zones. Some of the challenges, though, are many that Jeff has already mentioned. In some cases, these individual records only span a matter of hours. In other cases, they span a matter of years. So you have very few contemporaneous records. The platforms also vary. So not all of these are, say, stable, stationary towers or building sites. Some of them are moving aircraft or moving ships. And so that means that the kinds of information you're capturing is actually a little different platform to platform. The kinds of processes that you could target is a little bit different. The calibration protocols also vary substantially, and that, for me, is particularly concerning because I think it means that it's hard to really start to compare sites as though you're comparing apples to apples if they haven't accounted for the same biases in equivalent ways. And then again, as I mentioned before, we have the limitation that most of our modern water vapor isotopic in situ measurements really only go back to the mid-2000s. So with those sorts of limitations, many studies have really moved towards or have leaned on remote sensing of water vapor isotopes as a way to sort of cover a broader geographic area in a climatological sense. And there are a number of satellite-based instruments that do give us some record of water isotope ratios in water vapor. And some of those are listed here. So for example, TESS and IASI, SCIAMACHI, GOSAT, ACE. Now, one of the things to realize about, I guess there are a couple things to realize about satellite measurements. One is that there tend to be large uncertainties around the retrieval. The second is that they have very big spatial footprints, and so that can really impede our ability to analyze smaller scale processes. And the third thing is that they sort of are very good at getting a chunk of the atmosphere that's kind of smeared out, so it sort of covers a broad swath of the atmosphere, and at the same time, usually just that one particular chunk. And what I mean by that is when you look at this list, TESS and IASI are going to give you some very valuable information, but only about the mid-through troposphere. SCIAMACHI and GOSAT are going to give you something about the total column of total column water. And then ACE is much more sensitive to the upper troposphere. So all of them have limitations in the part of the atmosphere that they can actually resolve. And alternative to the space-based remote sensing instrumentation are ground-based FTIR. And the figure here on the right is actually showing some of the stations part of the NDACC network, NDAC. There's also TCON, which is another network. And for many of you, these stations may be a little more familiar in the role that they play in a multi-platform network like MUSICA, which has been led by our European colleagues. And really the idea here is that instead of just taking the ground-based remote sensing sites, MUSICA is also trying to take information from IASI, so a space-based instrument, also some in situ data on the ground and by aircraft to try to cover the globe in a broader sense. And really, for more information about MUSICA, I would refer you to some of Matthias Schneider's work and paper by his colleagues. So a little more, I guess, moving from networks that have already existed into a little more networks that are sort of up and coming or in development. One of the ones in my mind for water vapor isotopes is the National Ecological Observatory Network, or NEON. And NEON holds a lot of promise. It's going to cover these 19 different ecological domains that are painted different colors in the map on the right. Many of these, the core terrestrial sites, are going to have these tower-like systems illustrated by the little schematic to the left of the map. All the sites will have identical instrumentation calibration procedures, so that gets rid of some of those challenges that we saw with the uncoordinated water vapor studies. They also hope to provide 30-minute water vapor isotopic data. And they're going to be operating over the next 30 years. So we actually have this opportunity to think of analytical strategies that could take advantage of these observations over the next 3 decades. Another nice thing about NEON is that there are these PI-led opportunities. For example, there are mobile sites where you can actually propose to put up your own instrumentation and design your own process-led studies. Now, all those advantages stated, I think that there are also some challenges or a few concerns in NEON as well. Some big ones are we've seen them really face some delays in getting their isotopic measurements up and running. We've seen some cutbacks due to budget constraints. There's still some uncertainty about how effectively they're going to calibrate and process the 30-minute isotopic data. And though I'm a little less familiar on this, I think there are some concerns that they're not covering other types of the water budget in their isotopic measurements.
So moving on to the ocean now. GeoTraces is this ongoing effort, and there is a new database and atlas available, so I'll refer you to this 2018 paper in Chemical Geology to learn more about that. But many ocean cruises, not all, but some, do collect samples for stable isotope ratios, delta 18 and delta D. And so the current data that are available are archived in this database, and you can plot all that data up in this nice atlas form online, like the figure on the right here. So this is an opportunity and something to advocate for on future cruises participating in GeoTraces. A great chance to get these long transects of data across various parts of the ocean. And so we'll touch more on that in a few slides, but now moving on quickly to some short-term network opportunities.
Yeah, I wanted to throw this in there because in addition to more established networks, I just wanted us to remind ourselves that in the absence of having great established networks, we have made do with some really clever collections. One example of that is during Superstorm Sandy. There's a real crowdsourcing effort led by Steve Good and colleagues to try to collect precipitation samples all across the eastern starboard, and those are shown by those colored circles. They're colored by the isotope ratio of 18 in precipitation. And it was really an effort, hey, if you've got a bottle or a bag and you can grab something and stick it in your freezer, then send it in to us and we'll do the lab analysis. So it was a great way of getting broad spatial coverage over the storm, but probably something not super sustainable for a long-term effort. And then, you know, a somewhat different take on a short-term or loose network is these sort of efforts to try to compile data from various ship cruises. In this case, I have some tracks of water vapor measurements made for the cruise that Marian Benetti compiled, but many other folks, including folks in this committee, have also compiled that data or used that compiled data to answer network-like questions. And then I think our kind of where we wanted to finish in terms of describing networks that are available is this one slide on maybe some other new measurement opportunities that may fall a little outside the traditional bounds of a network, but nevertheless maybe something that we want to consider as a group in just some more detail. So I can speak a little bit to the NSF side here, the first and fourth bullets, I guess. Here at NCAR, we support the Lower Atmospheric Observing Facility. That's the thing that looks like loaf. And as part of my coming to NCAR, there's now a requestable water isotopic analyzer that flies on NCAR's aviation platforms. And so, again, I think traditionally people will request the aviation platform, target a specific area, a specific time period, and with a really small scale process and a very specific instrument load. But there have been examples to the contrary. So for example, HIPPO and also ATOM, which is actually flying on NASA right now, these efforts are really trying to scan the atmosphere and develop a picture of the atmosphere climatologically over different seasons, over as much of the globe as possible. So perhaps we could think about using that type of a platform to try to get a climatological picture of water vapor isotope ratios. Lotus is a slightly different effort that is also here at NCAR. It's still very much under development, which maybe means it's a good chance to weigh in on what kinds of instrumentation they should include. But the idea is that they would have a kind of army of small towers and instrumentation that could be deployed to study boundary layer processes wherever a PI requested for a somewhat short time frame, think on the order of a season or two. But it would be an entire observational network, if you will, that you could deploy for a short time and ask a question that might have an isotopic component.
And then just touching on the ocean very briefly towards the end of this, it would be a fantastic opportunity to get involved in geotraces as well as any other, opportunistic cruise where we could just get water samples and fill in some of the gaps in the ocean in terms of isotope ratios and their variability. So that could be through geotraces, which we'd already discussed, other cruises, and then this TPOS 2020 opportunity, which Sam has been talking about along with David and others. And this is a particularly exciting opportunity because it could give us these continuous, contemporaneous samples from across the tropical Pacific. And one thing that would be very ideal about this is that these samples would be far removed from islands and far removed from island hydrology influences, and they'd be far more representative of open ocean conditions. So that's something I think that we should discuss more in the near future. So we'd just like to wrap up with this final slide, thinking about some questions for you all in terms of why do we need to design a new network of observations. So hopefully our presentation has shown the limitations of the current observations and the opportunities for future sampling. But in particular, we need to know, what kind of network do we want or need to answer our particular science questions? And logistically speaking, where can we leverage already planned efforts or influence the planning processes, such as with TPOS 2020, to get in on the ground floor and get some of these samples? And then, finally, are there what we're calling gold sites, sites that would be a focal point for a larger community of isotope scientists, or sites perhaps already pre-existing data which show promise? And of course, sites where maybe those local observations capture larger scale processes like the Borneo Delta 18 record I showed earlier, or perhaps just sites that could be used for multiple science questions, multiple purposes. And then of course the final question is in terms of the perhaps hindrances or hurdles, how are we going to tackle funding, calibration, coordination, supervision, and curation? And so we'll just leave you with a final quote. I think that just shows that this is something that the broader isotope community is grappling with, this lack of an ideal network, observational network to address our 21st century climate questions. So we will just go back and leave these questions up here and hopefully have a few minutes of discussion.